Okay, this is Survey of the Nonprofit Sector, Lecture 8, Measurement and Evaluation. Outline for this lecture, we're going to first talk a bit about the history of measurement, define inputs, outputs, and outcomes, talk about Campbell's Law and Goodhart's Law, differentiate evaluating advocacy from traditional evaluation of service providing nonprofits. Then we're going to talk a bit about structural change and its benefits as opposed to targeted aid. And then we're going to end with Sunstein's theory of social change. Okay, I want to talk a bit about the history of measurement and reporting in the private sector and accounting rules. So prior to the stock market crash, we did not have a regulated or universal set of standards for how businesses had to report their finances. And many attribute the crash actually to partially this problem. Is if you were trying to invest in a business, you had to look specifically at their what they were measuring, and each business was measuring different things, so it was very hard to compare businesses to each other. So this problem kind of necessitated the desire to create a set of universal principles for reporting accounting measures. Since we did this, some would argue that having this standard of financial reporting has really given us a leg up and really been a boost to our economy. It's one of the pillars of a successful society. It's like the infrastructure for business. Just like if you don't have good roads, if you don't have good water treatment and sewage, you don't have good transportation, etc., it's going to be harder for your society to do well. In the same way, if you don't have standard measures for reporting business finances, it's going to be really hard for investors and for customers and owners to do well in business. But there was pushback. Businesses first argued that it was impossible for businesses of different types to adhere to the same set of accounting rules. And of course there are problems, but in general the benefits have been really great. Now, why do I bring this up? As of now, we do not have the same type of thing in the nonprofit sector, and I'm going to spend a bit of time today explaining why and maybe what we're doing to try to get maybe a better way to compare nonprofits to each other. One of the most important things to understand is the difference between inputs, outputs, and outcomes in a non-financial sense. So I think the best way to talk about this is using an example. So in education, you have inputs, or the things that go into the system. So you have a number of teachers, buildings, supplies, students, all the inputs to the system. Then the system creates outputs. So you could count the number of student classroom hours, you could measure test scores, you could measure grades. Okay, and then finally, outcomes are reflections of larger goals or societal desires. So an outcome could be smarter or more well-rounded people, literacy, some measure of human development. These are generally harder to measure, harder to define, and the connection between inputs, outputs, and outcomes is not always clear. So we could argue that the higher the test scores we have in a certain place, maybe you're going to have smarter, more well-rounded people, or maybe higher literacy rates, right? But that connection isn't 100%. There might be other things that go into some of these outcomes we see in society. And then to take that even one step back, how do we connect the inputs? Having more teachers, does that necessarily lead to some of the outcomes that we hope for in education? Okay, so understanding the difference between inputs, outputs, and outcomes is extremely important when we're talking about nonprofit evaluation. I'm going to talk a lot about that. Okay, back to the history of measurement and reporting, but now talking about nonprofits. So in the 1920s, the Better Business Bureau, they claim that they started reporting on nationally soliciting charities. I think what they were doing was the type of reporting they do for businesses, whether they're ethical. In 2002, they started the Wise Giving Alliance, and they created their 20 standards of accountability, where they really focus on whether the nonprofits were being financially responsible. That's most of what their standards look for, though they do have some about governance. In 1992, Charity Watch, formerly the American Institute of Philanthropy, was started by Daniel Borochoff, and their main focus was on financial records of nonprofit organizations, comparing what the nonprofit was reporting to what the state or the federal government had on record. In 2001, Charity Navigator was founded by Pat and Marion Dugan. They say they were passionate about charitable giving and social investing, but witnessed report after report of scandals at local and national charities. Decided to create an unbiased source of information that would provide charitable givers and social investors across the country with every type of charitable interest the tools necessary to make informed giving decisions. And theirs was really the first good website that had information about different nonprofit organizations. And what they were doing, similar to Charity Watch, they were gathering the 990 forms, which is the IRS form that nonprofits have to submit, which are also publicly available. So they would gather all of those. They also report on governance. Now, the key with these types of nonprofit evaluators was they were measuring inputs. So if you think about the finances of a nonprofit organization, the money that it's bringing in, either through fees for service or from donations, those are the inputs to the organization. So this kind of brings about the question, does it make sense to measure a nonprofit by the inputs that it brings in? Now, it's a bit more than just measuring inputs. It's measuring and paying attention to the ethics by which they take care of those inputs. All right, are they paying people not crazy high salaries? Are they not spending frivolously on overhead? Those types of things. But again, they're measures of inputs. In 2007, Holden Karnofsky and Ellie Hassenfield, they were both working in finance. In finance, there's so many measures for the success of a business organization. Karnofsky and Hassenfield wanted to find the nonprofits that offer the greatest social return on investment. They soon realized this type of information was not out there, so they quit their jobs and started GiveWell to determine which nonprofits do the most amount of good with the smallest amount of resources. This requires deep philosophical and intellectual thought combined with in-depth site evaluations, and their focus is mostly on nonprofit or international nonprofits. And then in November 2019, Impact Matters. At the recording of this current video, this hasn't happened yet, but they're planning to have cost effectiveness ratings of 1,000 plus service delivery nonprofits in the United States. Now, this is a big shift with GiveWell. Remember, before I was talking about how previous nonprofit evaluators were really evaluating inputs. Well, the shift here now is we're actually now evaluating outputs and outcomes of nonprofit organizations. If you're trying to look at which nonprofit does the greatest amount of good with the inputs it is given, now you are looking at which nonprofits produce the most outputs or generate the best outcomes for society. Now, this is really tricky, right? Because what outcomes do we actually want? And what necessarily means the best for society? A lot of this is based on values and norms, but also there are some philosophical implications about what are the value of animals compared to humans? What is the value of future lives compared to current lives? And so there's a lot of intellectual thought about these issues. Okay, kind of putting this all together as we target success. Nonprofits by definition are not in it for profit. Their goal is their mission. There's no set of reporting standards other than 990 form, which is financial. And again, those are inputs. So there's no set of reporting standards for outputs in the nonprofit sector. So what we see generally is metrics that are tied to an individual organization's mission statement. So the mission statement defines what the organization does and what they hope to do in society, and so then they kind of measure themselves against their own mission. Okay, now bringing this back to the sort of the Hayekian versus the planner, or as I would say, the effective altruist view of nonprofit evaluation. The Hayekian view lets allow all nonprofits to pursue their own goals, and then we evaluate them how they achieve their own goals. Did they achieve, what they set out to do? Where the planner or effective altruist perspective is this philosophical debate about which goals are most worthy of attention, and then finding the best way to achieve those goals or outcomes. So maybe it's not okay to let everyone pursue goals because maybe not all those goals are worthy. And again, big philosophical and normative debates about whether this is even something we should do or can do. Can we evaluate which goals are worthy? Okay, so coming back, different metrics in different fields. In finance, there's ROI, return on investment. So if I invest $1 million and it returns 1.4 million, then my ROI was 40%. And with the rise of GiveWell, now we're seeing the same idea applied to social causes, but often we use the term cost effectiveness. So for example, for every about $3,000, the Against Malaria Foundation saves one life. But again, we see the link between an input and an output. What do I get for my money? Previous to GiveWell, this was not really considered as part of nonprofit evaluation. Okay, so again, inputs, outputs, and outcomes. I'm hammering this down. Let's do another example, a road infrastructure example. So the inputs would be construction workers, the jobs, all the materials that go into it. The outputs would be the roads, the street lights, and then the outcomes hopefully would be something like economic development or increased safety. Measuring inputs is easy. Outputs is a bit harder, can be easy at times, can be difficult at times. Measuring outcomes is very difficult. And measuring the link and being confident about the causality between the inputs and the outcomes is one of the hardest things. How do we know that if we get more construction workers, build more roads, that is going to lead to more economic development, or that the economic development we did see was directly tied to improved infrastructure? Now, theoretically, we probably believe that, but do we have reasons or empirical evidence to show us that? Again, this is the big major issue in nonprofit evaluation. Okay, let's shift gears a bit, talk about impact investing. So impact investments are investments made with the intention to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. So the idea here is a normal investor looks around and has money to invest, and they invest in whatever organization they think will give them the biggest financial return, or set of organizations will give them the best financial return or the safest and best return. Impact investing now includes social and environmental impacts. So which type of business will give me both a financial return as well as these social and environmental returns? The Global Impact Investing Network is attempting to formulate a standard set of metrics for measuring social and environmental impact called IRIS. We know measuring social and environmental outcomes is harder to do than measuring financial goals. But again, going back to the history, remember how impactful GAAP was for the accounting world and business. It completely changed the landscape of how we do business in this country and our ability to trust the information that we see coming from businesses when it's been audited. In the same vein, will things change if we are able to get a standard set of metrics for the social and environmental impacts of a business? And then if we do get a standard set of metrics that makes sense for all the different types of businesses, Now we could start to compare what is the social or environmental impact of this business versus another business. But there's a lot of skeptics, just like there were skeptics about GAAP back in the day who argued there's so many different types of business, we can't have all these a standard set of financial or accounting measures. In the same way, there are so many types of businesses and organizations and nonprofits. Can we have a standard set of social and environmental impact metrics? I think that's still an open question. Okay, what to look for in impact metrics? As I hinted, impact relies on comparison, referring to baseline data. You could be referring to individuals before and after they received the intervention of your organization. You could be comparing individuals who received your intervention versus those who didn't. The best type of data has some sort of comparative aspect to it. Another thing to think about is the causality and the other factors which could affect the outcomes you're interested in. So if you're trying to measure the outcomes of your organization, you have to think about, okay, what else could be affecting those outcomes? And then again, as I'm going to pound the floor about this, think about inputs versus outcomes. Here's another example, farmers in poverty. So with the input, we can give them agricultural tools, we can give them knowledge about better approaches to farming. The output would be higher crop yields, and then the outcome hopefully is increased household income. Other things to look for, you can look for short versus long-term goals and intermediate outcomes. So an example, if reducing the prevalence of malaria is your long-term goal, an intermediate goal could be the number of people sleeping under anti-malarial bed nets. So again, the goal overall is not to just get people sleeping under bed nets. The big goal is to reduce malaria and the number of people that are affected by it. Direct and spillover and flow-through effects. So direct benefits are the main benefits your intervention seeks to have. Spillover effects are the effects of your intervention on the people around the target population. And then flow-through effects are the indirect effects over time that your intervention may have on the target population. So these are all outputs or outcomes that you may need or probably need to consider. Your intervention is targeting a specific group. How is that intervention affecting the people around it? Are there negative externalities? Or again, does your intervention have a short-term positive impact but a long-term non-impact? Do you know that? That's the type of information that becomes very powerful. And then finally, supply chain. What are the effects of your intervention or your work on every step of the supply chain? Yes, you may be doing great work for your target population, but for the people along the way in the supply chain, how does what you're doing affect them? How does what you're doing affect your own workers? How does what you're doing affect maybe your suppliers, people you're getting inputs from? And are those worthy things to measure when we're talking about evaluating nonprofit organizations? Okay, I think in any discussion about nonprofit evaluation, there needs to be an acknowledgement of Campbell and Goodhart and their laws. So I'm just going to read Campbell's law. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures and more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. And then Goodhart's law, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. We're going to look at some examples here. But more quotes. Incentives work, as Steve Jobs said. So if you have to be very careful of what you incent people to do, because various incentive structures create all sorts of consequences that you can't anticipate. And then Sam Altman, who's the president of Y Combinator, which is a Silicon Valley startup organization that helps people create startups. He said, it is really true that the company will build whatever the CEO decides to measure. Okay, so whatever you're deciding to be your impact metrics really become motivators and incentives for the people working in your organization. So to be very careful, because these can lead to consequences you don't even anticipate. So one classic example was in India. The government offered rewards to people who caught and killed snakes. The unexpected result, people started to breed more snakes in order to get the rewards. This is also referred to as the Cobra effect, when an attempted solution to a problem makes the problem worse as a type of unintended consequence. The other classic example is nail factories in communist Russia. So the first metric was determined by the number of nails produced, and so what happened was the factories produced tons of really, really small nails that weren't useful. So then they changed the metric to success based on the weight of the nails, and so the factories then began producing gigantic, heavy nails. I think part of the issue and part of the thing to remember with Campbell and Goodhart is there's a spirit of the law, and maybe remembering the spirit of the law or the spirit of the metric might help. So the spirit of this government reward to catching and killing snakes was they wanted less snakes. Okay, the spirit of nail factory metrics was some way to measure the outcome or the outputs of the nail production. How well were they doing? Were they producing what they needed? But I think Campbell and Goodhart provide really helpful things to remember when applying impact metrics in your organization. And then finally, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Measurement is the first step that leads to control and eventually to improvement. If you can't measure something, you can't understand it. If you can't understand it, you can't control it. If you can't control it, you can't improve it. So we're kind of in a catch-22 with impact metrics can have a profound and large impact on the ability to do great work in the world and to know that we're doing great work in the world. At the same time, it can have unintended consequences. It can lead to perverse incentives where people do things that are against the spirit of whatever the organization is really trying to do. Okay, now evaluating advocacy. Much of the discussion up to this point has been talking about how do we evaluate the service providing type of nonprofits, the ones where you can see the inputs, see the outputs of the service they're providing, and then try to connect it to outcomes in society. Evaluating advocacy is so much more difficult than evaluating service delivery programs. Politics evolve in non-systematic and non-linear fashions. We can't really use the scientific method like we try to do with service delivery evaluation. It's really a form of trained judgment and tacit knowledge. It's really difficult to isolate causality. Did my advocacy directly cause this output or outcome? It's really hard to isolate that because there's so many things that affect political outcomes. As I say here, sometimes, or as the authors say, sometimes political outputs are reasonably proximate and traceable to inputs, but sometimes they're quite indirectly related. They take decades to come to fruition, and then we have to figure out the relationship between the outputs and the outcomes. Professor Eric Patashnik talks about policy durability. So you might have a political output as a result of advocacy, but does that political output actually stick? Does it create a platform for further change? Does it help institute cultural or social change when it's needed? It's one thing to change a law, it's a different thing to change how people feel about things. From the perspective of grant makers, they can take the spread betting approach to making grants. So if you're really, as a grantor, and you're wanting to advocate for a particular cause, rather than put all your eggs in one basket of one organization, you could spread this to a wide range of organizations, strategies, scenarios, or issues. This is the portfolio approach that you see in finance. So when investing in one organization, you are at the risk of that. If that organization fails, you lose all your money. But if you invest in many organizations and one of those organizations fails, it's okay because you have other organizations to provide a little bit of you're dealing with the risk better by having a more spread out portfolio of investments. Same thing with grantors who want to advocate. They should spread out their money to a bunch of different advocates. And then finally here it says funders should evaluate their portfolio using a longest feasible time horizon, recognizing that political processes don't end after a piece of legislation passes or a court decision is handed down. Political wins in the form of court decisions or new laws or new policies are often great, but that is not where it ends. Much of advocacy happens after that. I think this to me is the biggest helpful way of thinking about evaluating advocacy, and that is rather than evaluating the acts of advocacy, we should evaluate on the advocates themselves. Instead of focusing on the work that they're doing, which as we've noted, it's hard to connect the work of advocacy and the inputs of advocacy to the outputs. Maybe we should just think about the quality of the advocate themselves. Are they well connected? Do they have expertise? Do they have a history of having success? That may be the better way to evaluate whether advocacy is going to be successful, is to look at the qualities of the advocate themselves, or the organization itself. Strategic capacity, their formal strategic plan, the wisdom of their leadership, their board, and their overall ability to think and act collectively. Are they a well-functioning unit? Do they adapt to opportunities and challenges? If we can get a better idea of what the organization actually is, we actually may have a better idea of whether their advocacy is going to be successful. Another way, and I briefly mentioned this, is to measure their network. What is their reputation? What is their influence in the policy space? This again, unlike evaluating the work that the direct inputs and how they relate to outputs, like a service, like we try to do with a service organization, how well is this organization connected? Do the people working in this organization, do they have personal or professional networks that would give them a step up when advocating for these specific things? So as they say here, the real art of advocacy evaluation, which is beyond the reach of quantitative methods, is assessing influence, which is what funders are really looking for. So now we start to see we have some appropriate models. So when we're evaluating service providers, we might think about the scientific method, but what model is appropriate for evaluating advocacy? And the authors talk about the analogy of the foreign intelligence analyst. So foreign intelligence analyst consumes social government reports and statistics, which she knows provides a picture of the world with significant gaps. She also talks to insiders. Some she trusts, some she doesn't. In many cases, she learns as much from what she knows are lies as from the truth. And it's all of these imperfect sources of information pieced together rather than a single measure or impact metric that helps an analyst gore out what is actually happening. It's the quality and experience of the analyst, their tacit knowledge, that allows them to create an authoritative picture. So in the same way, we kind of have to do the same thing with advocacy. We can read reports, we can look at some data, we can talk to people who know, and through all these different methods, we kind of triangulate at the quality of the advocacy that's going on. In thinking in academic terms, this is really applied anthropology. Anthropologists study particular cultures in a place, and then what works better in practice than on paper. They study culture or a hidden structure, which is invisible to outsiders, poorly understood by insiders. You really have to be a part of the culture to understand it. So until you've actually been there observing and living that, it's really hard to understand. Um, and so through also understanding the culture, you start to get a better idea of informants, networks, and trust. So when we think again about maybe which academic fields might be most helpful, when we're evaluating service delivery, we can look to the tools of economics and statistics to determine impact. And in evaluating advocacy, we can act like anthropologists. This is really important because often what we see in the world is misapplied evaluation, where we attempt to use economics or statistics to evaluate advocacy when it really doesn't fit. We need to act like anthropologists, try to understand culture, try to act like the foreign intelligence analyst who is taking all these bits of information and piecing it together. In the same way, the tools of economics and statistics provide powerful ways for us to understand the work of service delivery nonprofits, ways for us to connect statistically the inputs to the outputs and maybe some outcomes. And then we can see really the correlations between these things. So I'm not an advocate of one over the other. My biggest push is what is the most appropriate method for evaluating the type of work that is being done, and making sure that we choose the most appropriate method when we're evaluating different types of work in nonprofit organizations. This leads to a slightly different idea worth considering here is, should you work on advocacy or should you just work on targeted aid? This is a big, I think, philosophical question that many people may not consider, but probably should spend more time thinking about. There are benefits and costs both to working on systematic change or working on targeted aid. So with systematic change, we don't actually know whether a big systematic change will actually lead to positive outcomes or improve the status quo. So again, this is like the Hayekian view. It's true that lots of effort, money, and resources get canceled by the opposing side. So you spend a lot of your time working in advocacy being canceled out by people who are working directly to oppose you. And that can be hard. Democracy is designed to be slow and incremental. So these wins, again, as I mentioned previously, you have to take very long time horizons when measuring or trying to evaluate the work of advocacy. And then finally, with social issues, policy change is only one piece of the puzzle. Changing hearts and minds is a whole other matter and may not even be possible. You know, can we even change people's minds and hearts? I'm not sure if that's even true. Targeting aid, it's easier to measure and have confidence that the impact is real and positive. So when we're talking about targeted aid or service programs, it's really easy to measure. Okay, these were the inputs we had. These were the observed outputs. We could try to measure maybe a connection to some sort of outcome in society. And so we can have more confidence and more quick and small wins that keep us going and keep us fighting the good fight. I think there's value in both. Again, I think there are systematic changes we need to make in society. I do think, and again, this is just me talking, maybe I'm revealing myself a bit. It's hard to know what all of these changes are going to lead to. I think 5 or 6 years ago, we would never have predicted where we're at today. So maybe focusing just on targeted aid where you know you can be confident that what you're doing is actually making a difference in the world. But again, both I think have value. Now, let's the question about how social change happens. Most of the theories about social change refer to contagion effects. You know, it spreads like a disease. People, policies, one policy you'll see appear in one state, and then next thing you know, in a few years, multiple states have taken on that policy. We saw this happen with the new legal designation for benefit corporations. This just spread like a disease throughout the country. May have been a good disease, but who knows? With social change, though, using contagion metaphor is like describing water as wet. It's not an explanation, it's more of a restatement. So I think one of the more interesting recent theories about social change comes from Cass Sunstein. He's a professor at Harvard. He has a really interesting idea about how social change happens, and it comes in 3 steps. The first is preference falsification, the second is diverse thresholds, and the third is interdependencies. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about the case study that really influenced Cass Sunstein and his thinking on how this happens. So you had some researchers, they were talking to Saudi men and their opinions on whether their wives should be working. When they asked these men individually, the men believed that other Saudi men believed their wives should not work. But when they were given the opportunity to speak anonymously, most Saudi men actually thought it was okay for their wives to work. So this is really crazy, right? Internally, they had this belief that it was okay for their wives to work, but they believed that other people didn't think so. But those other people actually secretly believed that it was okay for their wives to work. So there was this overall idea that everyone else thought wives or women shouldn't work, but secretly all of them thought it was okay for their wives to work. This kind of speaks to the power of culture, right? It was this culture in Saudi Arabia that was keeping men from expressing their true desires or their true feelings. So the first idea Sunstein provides is what he calls preference falsification, which is basically that people don't reveal their actual preferences. People might say they like an existing status quo when they really don't, or they might change the subject when it's raised, or they might turn off a little voice in their head, or they may not have strong opinions, or they may not have thought a lot about the topic and they don't really want to express or reveal that. Okay, so again, think about the Saudi men. They were not revealing their actual preferences. So then the question is, what gets people to reveal their true preferences? And the idea that Sunstein came up with was what he calls diverse thresholds. So the idea here is that some people require no support at all before they'll say what they think or before they'll join a movement. They're either courageous, foolhardy, or just really committed to the cause. Sunstein calls them the zeros in the sense that they need nothing to join a movement of one or another kind. Then that follows by the ones and the twos. So the ones need to see the zeros move or speak before they will speak. And then there's the twos who need to see 2 people speak or move before they will reveal their preference. And this goes all the way up into the hundreds. So some people need to see thousands of people committed to a cause before they will jump in and join the cause. Okay, now how do these work together? It's difficult to observe people's internal preferences in light of preference falsification, and we also don't realize what our threshold number is on any given topic. So some social change might appear to come out of nowhere, but in reality, a lot of people might have just believed that thing in the first place. We just needed to see a certain number of people supporting the issue before we went and joined them. Sunstein uses the civil rights movement here in the United States as an example of this. When you go back and read some of people's descriptions, a lot of, especially white people, were describing how, yeah, they actually thought there should be more equality in this country, but they were afraid to mention it because it wasn't popular to talk about in certain places. But once the movement started moving, they felt comfortable to join the movement and be supportive. And that's how what appeared to be such a quick change maybe wasn't that quick of a change because people secretly had that belief already. This goes back to the question of, do we actually change how people believe, or do we just get them to reveal what they secretly believe? This is, I think, still an open question, and part of the problem is we really don't know what people actually believe. The only true place that knows what people actually think is Google, because it knows what we Google secretly at night when no one's around. Other than that, we have culture and the norms of society that kind of hold us back from maybe revealing our true selves. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks.